Want to know the fastest way to find out who in your family actually loves you versus who just sees you as a potential ATM? Inherit a significant amount of money and watch how quickly people's true colors come out, because that's exactly what happened to me 6 months ago, and I've learned more about my family in these past 6 months than I did in my entire 28 years before this. So here's the situation. My grandfather passed away last year, and he was a pretty wealthy guy who'd been very successful in real estate. And when the will was read, I found out that he'd left me $300,000, which was completely unexpected because I honestly thought he'd split everything equally among all his grandchildren or leave it all to my parents' generation. Turns out my grandfather had very specific reasons for leaving me this money. He'd included a letter with the will explaining that I was the only grandchild who'd consistently visited him in the nursing home during his last 3 years. I'd call him every week and spend time with him on holidays when everyone else was too busy, and he wanted to reward that loyalty and also give me a head start in life since I'd been working 2 jobs to pay off student loans while living in a tiny apartment. The money came through about 6 months ago after all the estate stuff was settled, and at first I was incredibly grateful and emotional because my grandfather had been such an important person in my life, and knowing that he'd noticed and appreciated my visits meant everything to me. I didn't tell anyone except my parents initially because I wanted time to process everything and figure out what to do with the money. And my parents were happy for me and supported my grandfather's decision, even though it meant their other grandchildren got less. My plan was to pay off my $60,000 in student loans, put a down payment on a small house, and invest the rest for my future. Pretty boring and responsible stuff, but apparently that wasn't going to fly with my extended family. My brother Jake found out about the inheritance about a week after I got the money. I don't know if my parents told him or if he heard through some other family member, but he called me super excited and congratulated me and said we should celebrate. And I thought that was really sweet and normal until he said we should celebrate by me helping him buy the boat he'd been wanting. I laughed because I thought he was joking, but he got serious and said he'd been looking at this fishing boat that cost $50,000, and since I had all this money now I could help him out. And I told him there was absolutely no way I was giving him $50,000 for a boat. And he said I didn't have to give it to him. He'd pay me back eventually. And I said, Jake, that's not how this works. This is my inheritance, and I have plans for it. He got really quiet, and then said he thought family helped each other out and that I was being selfish by hoarding all this money when other people in the family were struggling. And I pointed out that wanting a $50,000 boat isn't struggling. That's wanting a luxury item you can't afford, and he said I was being judgmental and acting like I was better than him now that I had money. That phone call ended badly with him saying he was disappointed in me and he thought I'd be more generous, and I just sat there stunned because my own brother had the audacity to ask me for $50,000 for a boat less than a week after I inherited money from our dead grandfather. But that was just the beginning because apparently Jake told other family members that I'd refused to help him, and suddenly my phone was blowing up with relatives I hadn't heard from in years. My Aunt Carol called asking if I could help pay for my cousin's wedding, saying $20,000 would really make the event special, and when I said no, she said it must be nice to be so wealthy that I couldn't spare a little for family celebrations, and I told her $20,000 wasn't a little. And I barely even knew my cousin since we hadn't spoken in probably 5 years. Then my Uncle Dave called saying he'd heard about my windfall and he was in a bit of a bind with some credit card debt and could I loan him $15,000 to get back on his feet. And when I asked why he had so much credit card debt, he got defensive and said that was personal and I was being nosy. And I said, well, if you want $15,000 of my money, I think I have a right to know what it's for. And he said, forget it, and hung up on me. My sister Amy, who I actually have a good relationship with, called me crying, saying she'd heard I was giving money to family members and she really needed help with her mortgage payment. And I told her I wasn't giving money to anyone and whoever told her that was lying. And she said Jake had told her I was helping people out, but apparently just not her. And I realized Jake was actively spreading lies about me to make other family members feel left out. I called Jake and confronted him about lying to Amy, and he said he wasn't lying, he was just telling people that I had money now, and implying that I might help family, and I told him that was manipulative, and he needed to stop talking about my inheritance to other people, and he said I couldn't control what he talked about, and maybe if I wasn't so stingy, people wouldn't be talking about it. The requests just kept coming. My mom's sister asked for help with her son's college tuition. A cousin I hadn't seen in 10 years asked for money to start a business. Another aunt asked me to co-sign a loan for her, and every single time I said no, I was met with guilt trips about how family is supposed to help each other and how my grandfather would be disappointed in me for being selfish with the money he left me. That last one really got to me because these people barely visited my grandfather when he was alive. Some of them didn't even come to his funeral. But now they were invoking his memory to try to guilt me into giving them money, and it made me absolutely furious. I ended up having a conversation with my parents about all of this because it was getting out of control, and my dad said he'd noticed family members asking him questions about my inheritance and he'd been shutting it down. But my mom admitted that she'd mentioned the amount to her sister in confidence, and apparently that sister had told everyone else. I asked my mom why she would do that when I'd specifically said I wanted to keep it private, and she said she didn't think it would be a big deal and she was proud of me and wanted to share the good news, and I told her that her sharing had created this nightmare where I was being harassed by relatives who saw me as a cash cow. My parents apologized and said they'd try to run interference with the family, but the damage was already done and people kept reaching out with increasingly ridiculous requests. My cousin Brandon asked for $30,000 to pay off his car and buy a new one. My Aunt Linda asked me to fund her vacation to Europe because she'd always dreamed of going. And my Uncle Tom asked if I'd be willing to invest in his friend's cryptocurrency scheme. And every time I said no, I got accused of being greedy or selfish or forgetting where I came from. The worst part was that these requests weren't coming with any acknowledgement of my relationship with my grandfather or any sympathy for my loss. It was just straight up asking for money like I'd won the lottery instead of inheriting from someone I loved who died. I started avoiding family gatherings because every single one turned into an ambush where someone would corner me and pitch their financial need. And when I stopped showing up, I got accused of thinking I was too good for the family now that I had money. Jake started posting passive-aggressive stuff on social media about how money changes people and how some people forget their roots when they get a little success. And I knew it was directed at me, but he'd never tag me or mention me directly, so I couldn't even call him out on it without looking paranoid. Things came to a head at my grandmother's birthday party about 3 months after I got the inheritance. I'd been avoiding family stuff, but I couldn't skip my grandmother's 80th birthday, and I showed up hoping people would just leave me alone for one day. But within an hour of being there, my brother Jake stood up and made this toast that started out normal, talking about how great Grandma was, but then he pivoted and started talking about how Grandpa had been so generous and how he'd want us all to take care of each other the way he took care of us, and he looked directly at me when he said it. Everyone got really quiet and uncomfortable, and then Jake said he hoped Grandpa's legacy would be about family unity and generosity, not about division and selfishness, and I realized he was calling me out in front of the entire family at my grandmother's birthday party. I stood up and walked out because I was so angry I couldn't even form words, and my grandmother followed me outside and asked what was going on, and I broke down and told her everything. About all the requests and the guilt trips and the way people were treating me like an ATM instead of a grieving granddaughter. My grandmother was furious. She said she had no idea people were harassing me like this and that my grandfather would be absolutely disgusted by their behavior, and she told me she was going to talk to the family and set them straight, and I begged her not to because I didn't want to cause drama at her birthday party, but she said this needed to be addressed immediately. She went back inside and I followed her, and she got everyone's attention and said she needed to say something, and then she absolutely tore into the family. She said she was ashamed of the way they were treating me, that I was the only grandchild who'd consistently cared for Grandpa in his final years while the rest of them were too busy with their own lives, and that I deserved every penny he left me. She said that if she heard about one more person asking me for money or making me feel guilty about the inheritance, that person would be uninvited from family gatherings and cut out of her will. And she meant it. The room was dead silent and people were looking at their plates. And Jake tried to say something, but my grandmother cut him off and said, "Especially you, Jake, asking your sister for $50,000 for a boat when you make a good living and just choose to spend irresponsibly is disgraceful." I had never told my grandmother about Jake's boat request, so she must have heard about it from my parents, and Jake turned bright red and left the party. And honestly, it was one of the most satisfying moments of my life, even though I felt bad that it happened at Grandma's birthday. After that confrontation, things got a little better. The constant requests slowed down, but the damage to my relationships was already done, and I realized that a lot of my extended family weren't people I actually wanted in my life. Jake and I didn't speak for 2 months after the birthday party incident, and when he finally reached out, he didn't apologize. He just said we should move past this and act like adults. And I told him that moving past it would require him to apologize for everything he'd said and done, and he said he didn't think he'd done anything that bad, and I was overreacting. I told him that asking me for $50,000 for a boat, spreading lies about me giving money to other family members, and then calling me out at Grandma's birthday party was absolutely that bad. And until he could acknowledge that and genuinely apologize, we had nothing to talk about, and he said fine, and we haven't spoken since. My relationship with several aunts and uncles is basically destroyed. They're polite when we're at the same family events, but there's this underlying resentment that I can feel, like they think I'm hoarding money that should be shared with the family, and it's made me realize that their love was conditional on what I could do for them. The crazy thing is, I did end up helping a few family members, but on my terms and in ways that actually made sense. My sister Amy, who'd been lied to by Jake, was actually struggling with her mortgage because her husband had lost his job, so I gave her $10,000 as a gift, not a loan, to help them get through a rough patch, and I did it because she'd never asked me for anything, and she'd always been supportive of me. I also set up a small college fund for my niece and nephew because education is important to me, and I want to give them opportunities, but I didn't tell anyone else in the family about that because I didn't want it to turn into a thing where everyone expected me to fund their kids' education. I paid off my student loans like I'd planned, and it felt amazing to not have that weight anymore. And I put a down payment on a small house, which was a dream come true, and I invested the rest in a retirement account because I wanted to honor my grandfather's intention of giving me a head start in life. The inheritance changed my life in terms of financial security, but it also changed my perspective on family and showed me who people really are when money is involved. And honestly, it's been one of the hardest lessons I've ever learned. I think about my grandfather a lot and wonder if he knew this would happen, if he suspected that leaving me this money would cause family drama, and I'd like to think he believed I was strong enough to handle it and set appropriate boundaries. There are still family members who bring up the inheritance in passive-aggressive ways. My Uncle Dave made a comment at Christmas about how nice my new house must be while he's struggling to make ends meet, and I just ignored it because engaging with that kind of manipulation isn't worth my energy. Jake has apparently told his friends and co-workers that I inherited a fortune and refused to help him, painting himself as the victim, and a few of his friends have actually reached out to me on social media to call me selfish, which is insane, but also shows the kind of person Jake is that he'd lie to his friends about this. My parents have been supportive overall, but sometimes my mom will make comments about how I could afford to be a little more generous with family, and I have to remind her that I was generous with Amy, and I'm setting up funds for my niece and nephew, but I'm not going to fund boats and vacations and pay off credit cards for people who made bad financial decisions. The whole experience has made me really cautious about dating too, because now I wonder if guys are interested in me or interested in my financial situation. And I've started being really vague about what I do for work and where I live because I don't want money to be a factor in new relationships. I've also become much more private about my life in general. I don't post on social media much anymore because I don't want family members keeping tabs on what I'm doing or what I'm buying. And it's sad that I feel like I have to hide my life from my own family. But that's where we are. Looking back, I wish I'd handled some things differently. Maybe I should have been more firm from the beginning about not discussing the inheritance with anyone, but I also don't think I could have prevented the greed and entitlement that came out in some of my family members, because those traits were always there. The money just brought them to the surface. My grandmother has been amazing through all of this. She checks in on me regularly and tells me she's proud of how I've handled everything, and she's made it clear to the family that the topic of my inheritance is off limits at family gatherings, which has helped but hasn't completely solved the problem. So that's my story. I inherited money from my grandfather who I loved, and instead of being able to grieve and honor his memory and use the money responsibly, I've spent the past 6 months being harassed by family members who think they're entitled to a piece of it. What do you think? Was I wrong to refuse all these requests and set hard boundaries, or did I do the right thing by protecting the inheritance my grandfather specifically left to me? Drop your thoughts in the comments because I'm still processing all of this and wondering if I could have handled it better. And if this story made you think twice about how money affects families, then definitely hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications for more crazy family drama. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.